Welcome back, everybody. Time once again for another episode of CRM Radio Today. Taking a look at the ever-changing, ever-growing CRM space with the man who's out there blazing the trail. In fact, he's out on the trail somewhere right now. Paul Peterson. Hey, Paul, how are you?
Hey, Paul. Yeah, you're right. Trying to close some business here before year end, and always a busy time.
It is amazing to me how people are out at the last minute. I mean, it's Christmas next week, and people are still out trying to close deals. I mean, in the old days, the world would just shut down for weeks here, but I think it goes right up until the 11th hour here.
In fact, one New Year's Eve, I was at a table with 3 doctors, a lawyer, and myself, a software rep, and I was the only one who was on call.
Oh, boy. Well, that shows the world that you're in. Well, we talked about in the opening here the ever-changing world of CRM. I don't think there is any more evidence of that, more dramatic evidence of the ever-changing world of CRM and certainly email compliance than all of this GDPR, CASL, CCPA, what? I don't know. All these initials here. You're going to explain them today.
Alphabet soup. Our guest today, Derek Lackey of Newport Thompson, have joined forces before as legislation is passed. Welcome, Derek.
Thank you, Paul.
And let's talk like we're at a cocktail party, and we're exchanging things, because I had a little background noise there, nice Christmas music. But boy, what a boring guest am I at a cocktail party. But it's important stuff. Let's talk a little bit about that legislation that started with CAN spam, and I think years ago when Do Not Call came out, that was one of our largest attended webinars. I think we had over 1,000 people Do Not Call. So that was many years ago. That's now passed. We got the new year, and we have a new set of legislation coming down in California. So many people may have overlooked it, right? Because this has implications across the country, right?
It does. It does. California Consumer Protection Act, but quite frankly, it's hard to maintain as a client a different system for every different region you do business in. Usually what happens is privacy programs are set to the highest bar, and that will now be California as of January 1st, 2020. And it's interesting to note, though, Paul, that this one, it's often compared to the European standard, which is really designed to protect the individual's complete privacy. CCPA is really more targeting those who sell data as part of their business design or their business model. And that's one of the biggest distinctions. So you have to be a business, so it doesn't apply to not-for-profits, and you have to sell data or share data in a way that has a monetary value or a meaningful value to your company. If you're in an advertising chain, for example, and you're part of the midware, you're definitely in the target of this new law.
Yeah, and I think financial service industries have been great for that, right? And they do disclose it. Maybe we use your information to recommend other financial products. How does that work for the average, I'll say, manufacturing business or other business service that, as a routine, they're not selling data? Should they still be involved here?
Well, I think that they should pay attention to some of the, what I would call open and transparency of this new law. In other words, when you're gathering data through a web form, for example, tell them what you're going to use it for. Tell them how long you're going to keep it. Tell them whether you're going to share it or not and who you're going to share it with. Like, be a little bit more open. Somehow, somewhere along the line in digital marketing, marketers checked out of respecting the customer. Like, we just thought we could do whatever the hell we wanted to the customer, and we can't. We never could, but we did. And now there's going to be laws that prevent it. I feel somewhat embarrassed as a marketer. I've been a marketer my entire career, and it is kind of embarrassing that they had to legislate me taking care of my customers.
I think in one of our conversations before, so when we talk about CASL and CAN spam, which CAN spam basically established you have to offer people the right to unsubscribe, right? To make that very prominent and then honor it.
And tried to make Americans more confident that when they unsubscribe, it meant something. Yes.
And then CASL expanded that a little bit, which extended primarily in Canada, right? But to avoid unsolicited email, and that just so buying a list of emails and powering them off, that in itself could have been a violation of CASL.
It actually definitely is. You can no longer buy lists in Canada. They're not valid because they form no form of consent. So you selling me a list, now if it's American email addresses, we can have at it. But if we're targeting Canadians, we have to have some form of consent. We have to meet the measures. And it's uglier than that, Paul. We have to prove it. So having consent is one thing, but you have to have a system set up that if the CRTC came to you and said, tell me why you're emailing Derek Lackey, you have to be able to go in and see what form of consent you have. So being able to tag in CRMs, for example, is critical. And you have to be able to prove it at all times. And it gets uglier. It's time limited. So the only one that isn't is express consent. Most other forms of consent in Canada, which are implied consent, have a 2-year time limit on them. So every 2 years you have to prove it again.
Those exceptions revolve around established business relationship, right? You're a customer or...
Yep. Existing business relationship, that's called, yep. Mm-hmm.
And then
there's another one called conspicuously published.
I resemble that remark. So what does it mean from the legal perspective, conspicuously published?
It means that if you publicly display your email on your website, for example, or on a blog, and now there's 3 criteria you've got to meet. You have to publicly display your email address. I have to know your title and role. So if I don't know your title and role, then I cannot stand by that I'm only sending you information that is relevant to a marketer, for example, if you knew my role was marketing. Those things have to line up. The other thing that the government allowed for is that if you publicly display your email address and you just add a line underneath it that says, this does not give you permission to email me, or something like that, it's called a restriction notice. It's a publicly displayed email without restrictions, is how it's worded.
And GDPR, I think GDPR had the exception of legitimate interest, right? How does that differ from any of the others so far?
Yeah, we don't have any lawful basis for processing here in Canada. We just have, do you have consent or not? But in Europe, in order to process any data you own, emailing somebody with their email address is processing against data. You have to have a lawful basis for doing so. And for most businesses, there are 3 lawful bases. One is contractual. So in order to fulfill a contract, you have to communicate. That's a legitimate one. And then there's one called legitimate interest. And legitimate interest is a bit of a catch-all, but it's in the best interest of your business and the individual. And you have to weigh it against, is it really a privacy breach? Is it really a privacy violation? Is it serious? So you do this weighing test to qualify for legitimate interest. Most experts in the EU, in the legal community, have clearly stated that most direct marketing as we know it can be claimed as legitimate interest. Now, not all, and you do have to go through the exercise. You have to prove that you thought it through. But legitimate interest is a legal base, a lawful basis. The third one is consent, and I did say third because it's the least one recommended. Most people think you need consent to do anything in Europe, and that's not so at all. Consent would be the last recommendation I'd make to our clients. When all else fails, go for consent. But I wouldn't do it first.
What have we learned about, so GDPR came out a year and a half ago back in, May of 18, and now we got California coming up. But you were sharing with me the other day that there's been some bite to some of this legislation for some companies recently in court.
Yeah, there's quite a bit of fining going on. There's actually a website. It just lists all the fines under GDPR, and it's quite robust. But I would have guessed that data breaches and lack of consent would be or lack of any lawful basis for processing would be the primary reasons for violations, but it's turning out they're fining against just about every article of GDPR, and there are 99 of them. So we've seen the fines cover the gamut. And I was a little surprised at that. I figured that they would pick on a couple of things like we did here in Canada, picked on consent and the lack of a working unsubscribe were the primary reasons for being fined under CASL for the first 5 years it's been in play. But it seems that there's many more colors in the violation and fines categories in Europe than we have here in Canada.
Before we take a break, do you think that most North Americans are aware that the Canadian law, CASL, and the GDPR passed by the European Union apply to them?
I think there's a little more awareness of CASL because it's been around a little longer. And at some point, most marketers who are using email as one of their cornerstone marketing activities are at least kind of aware that there's something different with when you're emailing Canadians. But GDPR, with 4% of your global revenue as a potential fine, has certainly captured the boardroom conversation, and I think the awareness is gaining, put it that way.
And I think GDPR goes far beyond email. It's more of a reaction to the Cambridge Analytics, where you had ethnicity and sex and religious affiliations, things like that, personal data that was being sold and being used in ways that the client didn't understand. So it's a little bit more heavy on what data of mine do you have? Can I see it? Can I edit it, delete it? And companies have to respect that. What I'd like to remind people, too, is that the law is it's a process, so your technology can help, as you were talking about at the beginning, but at the end of the day, you have to have a manual process, somebody in your company designated as the data controller and responding to requests, and as you're pointing out, make sure you log those requests so that you can always say, we got that request on this date, and we deleted it. I know within our own company, just think about all the systems where a customer might flow through, order systems, quoting systems, CRMs, mailing lists, things of that sort. And all of that has to be pulled together if the customer says, what do you have on me, right?
Absolutely. And that's one of the biggest challenges that most companies have with fulfilling or complying with GDPR is their data's all over the place. And without a method of bringing it all together, we're a big fan of preference centers that sit over top, and the preference center taps in via API to all the places you keep data in an organization. And it allows the customer on the one end to say, it's okay if you do this, but don't do that. Detail gets communicated to everywhere the data is kept and flows backwards as well. So it's one version of the truth. And I think you're going to see Preference Center become a very popular solution in the next 2-3 years. Because as companies struggle with this, they've got to come up with something.
And we're going to take a break, and after the break with Daryl Lackey of Newport, we're going to talk about shifting that, because now you're shifted into some of the recommendations and things people can do to leverage this, and you have some interesting take on why some of this legislation was actually good for business and marketing. So with that, Paul, let's take a break, and then we'll come back.
We know you rely on your CRM system, and it's usually a love-hate relationship. Most CRM systems, well, let's face it, they're expensive. They're hard to understand. People don't use them properly. And you're probably paying for features that you don't even want. If that's your case, then maybe it's time to simplify. It's time to get more from your CRM. Why don't you go back to the original? Trust Goldmine. We helped pioneer the industry, after all. Goldmine CRM is, well, it's simple, it's affordable, and it's proven. If all those sound appealing to you, if you're just tired of the CRM headaches that you're getting from trying to implement something that's just too complicated, too expensive, and too much for you to figure out, then why not go back to the original? Visit Goldmine today, goldmine.com. All right, back to Paul and his guests talking about the topic of the day, compliance, GDPR and the California rules and all the others coming. Are there any others coming down the pike, or is this it? Is this as far? First we had don't call, and then we had can spam, then we had GDPR. Are we at the end of the line, or is this just the beginning of control?
Oh, yeah, great question. It is the beginning. Yeah, for sure.
And we've seen other states indicate that they're going to take on the CCPA, right? And that in itself, Derek, is a moving target. It's an evolving target. There's already legislation to modify it. So it's one of these things that we're going to have to watch over the next year.
Well, the second form of consumer protection, a new law now is being proposed as part of the next election. They want it to be a referendum. And typically what the state of California does when referendums make it with the 3 million signatures and all the things that they need, when it makes it to being a referendum, usually the governor steps in and makes it law so that it doesn't have, like they're trying to reduce the number of referendums. So there's a second privacy law, far more expansive in taking care of people's rights. So I mentioned earlier that CCPA was predominantly about people who sell data. This one's going to be more general. So this one will probably have some kind of email restrictions in it and communication restrictions like Castle does. Yeah.
I think at the end of the day, and as we were talking a couple of weeks ago, you kind of said, gear your program to GDPR because that's where most things are going. So if you're following those guidelines, and by the way, GDPR, if you are a North American company marketing into the European Union, it applies and they can reach into you for fines. But I think your goal is first make sure you understand GDPR and kind of let that be your high water mark, the gold standard for permissions and so forth, right?
Yeah, there's even a higher standard than that. There's a process called Privacy by Design and Default, developed by Anne Kavukian, who was a former privacy commissioner here in Canada. And Anne is globally respected, and she's put out 7 fundamental principles. And if you base your privacy program on those 7 fundamental principles, you're going to be in line with most laws because most of the laws are written to fulfill on those 7 principles. And it's things like openness and transparency and privacy actually being implemented in the early stages of developing a product, not just slapped on afterwards. So they're a big proponent of privacy by design, like as you're developing a product or service, consider the privacy impacts. Make sure that you mitigate them in the earliest stage of product development.
You also mentioned if you collect all this permission and consent and other things, and that is honor it, right? Make sure you follow through. Don't just put it up as on the surface. Make sure it's deep within your company to honor it.
Yeah, amazing how many people just take another company's privacy policy and stick it in as theirs. Yeah, I've even seen cases where they didn't change all the instances of the name. It doesn't truly represent. A good privacy policy should fairly represent and open and transparently represent how your company deals with privacy. And I'm finding that in the actual execution that what I read on their privacy policy and what I see them do in their company, there's often conflicts.
We discussed these principles in our webinar, and I'm going to be posting a blog, so we'll notify everybody of what those are so that they can follow up. So, but you also had an interesting finding now that things like CAN-SPAM and cancel had been around a while, and other legislation in Australia, that there was some evidence that the laws actually helped marketers.
Yeah. Let me start out by saying that the mindset behind email marketing has been wrong since we started doing it. We only knew mass marketing in the late 90s when digital marketing and email started. So it's only natural that we brought a marketing mass mentality to a one-to-one medium. We didn't know how to treat a one-to-one medium. It was very foreign to us. But over the last 20 years, we've realized that more isn't better on email. Engaged is better. So people who say, well, we have 1 million on our email list. Yeah, but only 170,000 open them. You're bullshitting yourself. You're kidding yourself. So stop it. Stop emailing those other 830,000 and filling up inboxes and just focus on the ones who are actually engaged with you and interested in you. So that's kind of where the consent thing came from. Nimity, who is one of the automation platforms in the privacy space, published a map about 6 months ago of the toughest consent rules for email in the world. In Canada and Australia were two of the highest. There were certain parts of the EU, like Germany, that was up there as well. But really, it really was clear that Canada and Australia had the toughest consent laws. And then I came across a study at the end of 2018 from IBM that showed that Canada and Australia had the absolute highest open rates of email of any country in the world. And I don't think that's a coincidence, Paul. I think tougher stance on consent has actually allowed people to trust their inbox a little bit more and to not approach it like it's about to blow up on them. And I think that's where we were headed. Without some form of consent, without some sanity around who you're emailing, people were beginning to ignore it. I know people 5 years ago in Canada just said, I don't even check my email anymore. It's all just junk anyway. And we had to correct that. And that's why I'm the chairman of the Response Marketing Association here in Canada, and we very vocally backed Castle. Because yes, it was inconvenient for business because we'd done things a completely different way, and we had to change what we did, and that was inconvenient. But we believed that it would save email, and what we're seeing now, 5 years out, is it is saving email. People are beginning to trust it again. People are engaging more with their email, and we're getting far less junk. I do have a couple of broader emails that I use for junk, so I still get quite a bit to those because Gmail, you don't know that I'm Canadian because it's a .com. So I still do have a couple of email addresses that get filled with spam. But you should see my business.ca business email addresses are, pretty clean. Yeah.
So we're coming on the end here of our session, yep. And so I think with the moment that's a message of hope that says that permissions, segmenting, relevance, those have long been practices recommended by you and others. Make your message relevant. That means it can be shorter, but it's a little bit more targeted to some segment, prospects, customers of a certain type, and offering, as you said, preferences and subscriptions as to what information do they want to receive. So we'll publish some more recommendations with that. Any final thoughts for our audience as we approach the new year?
Well, based on what I'm seeing happen in the data, stay safe out there. I believe we're just seeing the tip of the iceberg with Cambridge Analytica. If you peel back real-time bidding and online digital advertising and see how many people sensitive data is exposed to on a daily basis, you'd be shocked at how your personal information is being used and abused. So, unfortunately, the more sophisticated we get with technology, the more these laws are going to be required.
Well, that's food for thought, and we'll definitely work with you and our audience to keep abreast of that. So thanks for joining us today. And Paul Roberts, I have a literary reference to Thomas Wolfe once said, you cannot go home, or you can't go home again. He's wrong. I took a United flight, and I'm in the middle of America at Omaha.
And you're halfway home. There you go.
I'm almost at home, whatever you call it. So to all of you, a good holiday season, a little time off, a little year-end. We'll come back, I think, in year-end with a recap and maybe some resolutions for next year. So thanks, everyone, for joining today. And, Derek, I'd have a drink with you at a cocktail party anytime. Surf's up, Paul.
Thank you.
You've been listening to another example of the only show that really takes you deep diving into the CRM world, and it's changing right now. Right here on the Funnel Radio Network for at-work listeners like you.